Hey, it's Patrick from JMP Cycles, and we're gonna show you how to put cams in this Evo Sportster. Let's talk about that. This is a 2001, and the cam installation for most Sportsters is gonna be very, very similar to this. Highly recommend you have the manual to your bike because there are some differences. For instance, the 99 and earlier models may require a pinion gear change, and as we get into the cam chest, we'll explain more of that. But overall, it's gonna be very, very similar. But let's talk about what cams and why. The cams we're putting in this bike are a drop-in cam. It's the Andrews N4. What drop-in means is that we shouldn't need any other modification mechanically. But let's say if you had an 883, this bike used to be 883, it's been recently converted to a 1200, and that N4 cam is just a good match for that without having to do any other work. When you start to go above like a 490 or 497 lift in that area, you can get coil bind. What that means is your valve springs in your head aren't set up to take any like real high lift. So you need to check that if you're putting anything other than a drop-in style cam, and most of the manufacturers will tell you if it's a drop-in cam or not. What coil bind means is the valve lift will be so much that it actually binds the coils, they bottom out as the valve opens up and squeezes the coil. So we're gonna do a drop-in cam with this. Shouldn't require any other modifications other than it works really well with the 1200. And again, I say that with an 883, you might, depending on your compression ratio, you can over cam a motor. So always take into consideration your complete package. So we're gonna do the Andrews N4s in this bike right here. It's also gonna require a jetting change, which we'll get to towards the end of the video. And as you can see, our bike is partially kind of disassembled already, and that's because we were doing the 1200 conversion to this. Now, we're gonna use S&S Quickie push rods with this, meaning we're gonna bolt cutter these out and go back in. If you wanna do it and you don't wanna cut your push rods out, you wanna keep your solid push rods in there, we'll put a link in there for the 1200 conversion that we did, and you'd follow that same procedure for reassembling the top end. Otherwise, we're gonna show you how to do it. So you already have a 1200, you wanna put these cams in, you don't wanna take all this apart. We'll show you how to do it with the S&S Quickies. Now, our bike is a little more disassembled, and because all these bikes are, all the bikes are different, you may not have the same intake and exhaust we had on this bike. This is where you're starting. So if you're doing it the quickie way, like we're gonna do, you wouldn't necessarily have to have your fuel tank removed here. You could probably leave your carb in there, although it's probably gonna get in your way. But you will need to take your forward or mid control off to get clearance to this, and you're gonna need to do all that just to get started. Now, the next thing we need to do is find top dead center on one of our cylinders. I'm gonna start with this front one. And the reason we're going to do that is because when it's at top dead center, that takes most of the pressure off, or the most pressure we can get off of these push rods, because our cams are gonna be on the base circle. We want those cams on the base circle. When we cut these, we want the least amount of pressure from our lifters here. So we're gonna find top dead center, we're gonna bolt cutter these out, we're gonna find top dead center in the rear, and we'll bolt cutter these out. The first thing you need to do is pull your spark plugs out, and I recommend disconnecting your battery. You need a buddy to help you, and while we turn that rear wheel, you're gonna put a thumb over the top of the spark plug hole. And when that thing comes up a compression stroke, you'll feel it start to push your thumb off. At that point, take something wooden like a thin paintbrush, or you can use a wooden pencil. Don't use anything metal or something that's gonna break. Put down in there, and as it comes up, you'll see it raise the pencil up, and right when it starts to drop down, that's top dead center, and that's where you wanna stop before we cut these off. So let's get our bike set up at top dead center. As it comes up on compression, and now it's gonna start to go down. You'll see it. See it go down? Then right there, actually went back the other way. That's the top. So that's where we need to be, and now we can cut those push rod tubes. Okay, so now we need to cut these, and don't do this with a grinder. Do it with bolt cutters, because you'll end up with a bunch of little bits in there dropping down. That's why I want to do this with bolt cutters, not with a grinder. So a common problem we've heard is my bolt cutters aren't big enough to get around that tube. Well, that push rod in there is a lot narrower than that tube. So you're gonna ruin these anyway, so you can take some channel locks and smash this down a little bit if you don't have big enough bolt cutters. down, right there. So now that the push rods are out, I like to take the lifters out before I take the cams out so nothing gets caught. There's no, nothing binding up. We're actually gonna go back with our stock lifters. In this one, if you're going back with an SNS or an aftermarket lifter, that's fine, it's the same procedure. I do recommend, especially if you have brand new lifters that you just bought, make sure you soak those in oil. So you might as well go ahead and throw those in oil right now. We're gonna go ahead and get our lifters out of here. Trying to get a hold of it, there we go. Also, it's worth noting when you take this stuff apart, especially for reusing it, the lifters and whatnot, I always like to put them back in exactly the same spot just because they do develop wear patterns, and it's best to put them back in the spot where they go. So wherever you're stashing them in the meantime, make sure you keep everything in order of how it came out to put it back. So slippery. Okay, so we'll do a little bit of show and tell here, just so you can kind of get an idea of how the valve train works. So this is one of our new cams. It doesn't really matter what cam it is. This is the cam lobe right here. And your lifter rides on that lobe, and specifically in one way. Now, we just a little bit ago talked about taking the little anti-rotation screws out. And what those do is they hold this in place. There's two flat spots here. Those screws slide by and hold this thing from turning. And the reason you don't want it to turn is because this has a wheel on it right here. And that wheel rides right on the cam lobe. And as the cam lobe comes around and gets to the big point where the fun stuff happens, it comes up like this. And as it comes up, it pushes this lifter up, which lifts this push rod. So this is one of our broken push rods here that we took out. The push rod sits right in this little cup here. It's made to sit in there just like so. And when the cam comes around, the lifter is riding on it on that nice smooth steel wheel. It lifts it up, which then lifts the push rod. And if you go back to our 883 to 1200 video, you'll see the top of your motor open there. And what happens when this lifts up in there, the other end of the push rod pushes the rocker like this, which then the other end of the rocker, as this one goes up, it goes down and opens the valve, which depending on the valve, it's either bringing in air or letting out exhaust. So just a little look behind the scenes how your valve train works. You might be able to get away with leaving the pulley cover on. I'm actually going to take it off just to kind of get it out of our way. Now the brake line, your rear master cylinder and brake lines attached here, you can just let that kind of hang out of the way. You don't have to take all that off unless you want to actually do something to this cover. So I'm going to take a 3/16 Allen, and there is a couple of Allens holding this, and then there is a nut down here that will have to get off as well to pull this all the way off. So this is a 3/4 sized nut here. I'm going to pull it off before I do the smaller Allens. Okay, now we have to address our ignition here because we have to take that loose before we can get this cam cover off. If you have a bone stock set up like this, you're gonna have to drill these two rivets out. It's not screws, they're rivets. You can drill them out and then you can replace it. You can replace them with screws later if you want to. You have to drill those out. Also, if you wanna do anything to your cam cover while it's off, we like to cut them, look a little cooler. There's a lot of actually dead space back here. You can cut this off, make it look really hot rod. So if you want to do that, you have to unhook your ignition. This one has a plug. Some of them I've seen don't have plugs. You have to cut them and rewire them. We're just gonna unplug ours. We're gonna drill these two holes out and take our ignition plate loose. But then behind that, there's a little cup, the little rotor cup that's in there, and it has to come off. The screw that's in it, the little bolt that's in it, is actually attached to the end of a cam. So after we get the ignition plate loose, we'll take that little rotor cup off there before we can take this cam cover off. So once we're inside, this is your ignition here. You need a flat bladed screwdriver and to take these out. Now, before we do that, I'm gonna mark exactly where this ignition is set in here. And how I'm gonna do that is there's a little V cut in here, and I'm gonna put a mark on the inside of this cam cover where that V cut is, so I know exactly where to put my ignition timing back to. Pull that loose. That's what we're after right there. So this is a 5/16, and it shouldn't be really gorilla armed on there. It should come off pretty easy. You can see when you put that back in there, it's got that little slot there, and it goes in this little groove on the end of the cam right there. So we'll need to reuse this for sure. So now we're ready to take our cam cover off. At this point, if you haven't drained the oil out of your engine, I would go ahead and do that because you're gonna lose some out of this cam cover. And as I take these screws out, I like to make myself a little, uber accurate drawing of this cam cover, and I'll put the screws in here just so I know where they came out of, because some of them vary in size a little bit. It's not the end of the world, but it's nice to have this little template, throw the screws in there. So we're gonna take our 3/16 Allen, start taking our bolts out, and then putting them into our template. Okay, we're ready to take the cam cover off. Have an oil pan handy, and then just know you might need to bump this a little bit to get it unstuck. Also, when you take this out of here, now that there's no pressure on the cams, some of the cams might actually stick in the cover and come out with it, so just don't let them fall on the floor or anything like that. Okay, once we get in here, there's one more thing to do. If you're not gonna do anything with your cam cover, you can just kind of move this out of your way. We're gonna cut ours, so I'm gonna need to disconnect this oil line, meaning I'm gonna cut this clamp loose here and have to put another hose clamp back on there before we do our install. If not, you can leave this, but otherwise you can cut this clamp off. We have our cover off now, and here's our stock set of cams. Pull the lifters out so we don't have any resistance when we're pulling the cams in or out. So we're ready to take these out and put in our new cams. You can kind of see here you got to pull the number 2 cam out first. After you pull that out, you can kind of pull the rest of them out. The other thing we need to talk about before we put cams in is make sure you clean those off really good with brake cleaner or something like that. They always feel kind of sticky out of the box. I like to get them good and clean. So we're going to remove all these cams, but then we need to check for clearance. The Andrews cam we're using is a bolt-in cam, and it should clear. Now what I mean by clearance is the cam lobe, when it comes around inside the case, as the big part of that cam lobe comes through there, that it's not going to make contact with the inside of the case. If it does, we have to clearance the case. And by clearance, I mean you get in there and you literally cut away part of the case. We shouldn't have to do that. This is a bolt-in cam, but it's always good to check. So we're gonna put the cams in there one at a time, spin them around to make sure they clear. Now on the number 2 cam here, it contacts with this, with your oil pump gear here. So in order to spin it around, you'd have to rotate the motor over, or it's got the same lift as all the other cams. You can put a smaller one in there if you can get it to rotate over, you can. But just check your clearances there. So I'm gonna pull our cams out. They should pull right out real easy. We're gonna do a quick visual inspection of the bushings that are in there. You wanna make sure they're not all galled up or have burn spots in them. If that is the case and you have damaged bushings, you need to replace those. So we're gonna pull these out, check our bushings out, clean off our cams, and then spin them around to make sure all of our lobes clear the case. We'll pull out number 2 first. Pull out number 1. This is number 3. And number 4. And with the bushings, we're just looking in the bushings there to make sure there's no like dark spots where it got hot or it's not galled up. These actually look pretty good in there. Okay, the cams go in a certain order. The number 1 cam, which is the farthest one back, has 1 dot on it. Pretty easy stuff. That's number 1. Number 2 is the cam with the really large gear and 3 dots, and actually has 2 gears on it as opposed to just 1. So number 2 has 2 gears, very large. The number 3 cam, pretty simple stuff, has 3 dots. 2 dots here on the shoulder and 1 dot on the gear. That leaves you with only 1 more cam, which is number 4. In case you're wondering, it actually has 2 dots on it. So that's where the cams go, 1, 2, 3, 4. So now that we know which one's what, we're gonna start with number 1. We're gonna throw a little assembly lube on there just to make sure things spin nice in there, and we'll start checking our clearance. So what we're looking for is this cam lobe to make sure it doesn't come in contact with this case up here, or back here in this case too. We'll just put it in there. And we're good. In with the lobe up. So now we're ready to put our cams in. We have to put 1 and 3 in first, and then we put 2 in because of how the oil pump gear and pinion gear all line up. You have to go 1, 3, and then 2. 4 is easy, I'm not gonna worry about it right now. Probably a little late for this, but if you're trying to use a 2000 and later cam setup on a 99 and earlier bike, you may have to change this pinion gear. In our case, we're fine. I know on like the S&S cams, on their hooligan kits, you can use them on earlier bikes, but you have to swap out pinion gears. So having said that, we're gonna start putting these in here. So when we put 1 in, we're gonna line that dot up facing over this way. And I'm gonna kind of show you an easier way to do that. I said you had to put 1 and 3 in first before you can put 2 in. That is true, but I'm gonna line up 1 first. And how I'm gonna do that is we have the 3 dots on our number 2 cam. 2 of them are wide set apart. 1 of them is kind of in the middle and offset. This little dot that's in the middle of the 2 that are split out there, it has to line up with the mark on our pinion gear. And the mark on your pinion gear is a little bitty line in the end of the gear. It's actually pretty tough to see. So in order to make the final install a little bit easier, For now, I'm going to line up the number 2 cam with the mark on our pinion gear and the mark on our number 1. So that's lined up right now. And now I can kind of see where number 3 is gonna have to line up. So number 3 has to line up. There's a dot over here and there's 2 dots over here. The 2 dots are gonna go towards the number 4 side. So now, but that's gonna give me an idea of where about I need to be, because I know I'm lined up on the pinion gear, I know I'm lined up on number 1. I'm gonna take number 2 out, but what I did that for was to kind of show myself where number 3 needed to be. So everything kicks off this pinion gear. When you're trying to line these up, you line these 2 up and rotate the little cams, the 1 and 3, to make them match these dots. Leave this sit, move these cams to make them line up with the dots. When we go to put number 3 in here, the single dot is gonna line up here. The 2 dots are gonna go towards number 4. Again, make sure you have assembly lube on your gears and your bushing surfaces. Now for the fun part. We're lined up here, we're lined up here, and we're lined up there. And be careful, you don't want to be 1 tooth off. You want everything to line up exactly. Now that we have 1 through 3 in there, we've got our 2 dots over here. Number 4 should slide right in. Okay, cams are in, and now we can start to button up the cam chest. So make sure you clean up your cam chest real good. We actually trimmed ours off. We actually trimmed our cam chest off a little bit, so we got it really good and clean, and now we're gonna put it back on. Make sure your gasket area is nice and cleaned up. There's no gunk on it. We're gonna put some assembly lube in the bushings on the cover, and then we're going to reattach our oil line to our fitting back here. Of course, we're gonna use a new gasket. I just wanna point out though, that make sure you have the right gasket. You can actually have a gasket with a holes line up here, but it'll be blocking off some oil passages. So just give a quick check, make sure all your oil passages have the proper cutouts, and things are gonna be flowing nice through there. So we're gonna put some assembly lube back on here, reattach our oil line, and then I'll go over the pattern that you tighten these bolts up and torque specs. Make sure this post is in here. Most times it don't come out, but post is in there. I'm going to push that just on there. It's on there real snug. It'll help hold it there. And then you can see we're all lined up. So now I gotta put our bolts back in the cam cover with 3/16 Allen. Now there is a sequence to these. I made this little pattern so all my bolts went back in the same spot. I'll probably throw a little bit of Loctite on here, not a lot. And then we'll put these in here and we'll tighten them down evenly according to the sequence. And then at the very end, you're gonna wanna tighten them to 80 to 115 inch-pounds. So we got number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So it's kind of a crisscross in the middle and then it goes around the outside. Okay. 4. 7, 8, 9. So while we're here, I'm gonna put our ignition back together. This little rotor cup has a little bump in it right there. A little tab that goes in that slot on the end of that number 2 cam. So we'll put that in there. It's kind of a little snug fit, which is fine. And then we'll put the screw that holds it in there. That's a 5/16 you're gonna need. Put a little bit of blue Loctite on there. Torque that from 43 to 53 inch-pounds. When you got that done, you can go ahead and put your actual ignition plate back in there. Hopefully you marked yours like I marked mine before we put that in there, so we know where those go. And then we'll plug it back in and we'll move on to the lifters. Okay, so now we're gonna put our lifters back in. We're gonna drop them down in these holes. If you're reusing your old lifters, I like to put them in exactly the same spot because they kind of have a wear pattern in there. If you're using a new lifter, you definitely wanna soak them in oil. It's very helpful. I threw ours in oil just kind of out of habit, but as you put them in, they have flat spots on the outsides of them. And when you put it in, you want them flat spots to the forward and backwards, so the wheel running with the engine case, so that cam lobe can ride on that wheel. And then after we drop them in their holes, we're gonna put these pins in here, and those are anti-rotation pins. And that pin rides up against that flat spot on that lifter to keep it from turning, keep that wheel on the lobe. Some of the older models are a little bit different than this. They'll have a little triangle piece here with the pins behind the triangle piece. Same concept, just a little bit different way to get there. After we put these in, put all of our locating pins in place, we're gonna torque these from 80 to 100 inch-pounds. Flat spots are here, my finger. And this anti-rotation pin goes in. Okay, so our lifters are back in the holes. The little keeper pins are torqued, and we're ready to start putting our push rods back in and adjusting them. Now, if you aren't using adjustable push rods like I talked about earlier in the video, I'll link you to our 1200 conversion video, and you can just follow the process doing it from the top down. But we use the quickies, so we bolt cut ours out of here. Now, when you do that, you cannot reuse the stock push rod covers. One, because you just cut them in two, and two, because the adjustable ones you need have a different base. So You have to get a different base like we have here, this one from Colony, or there are some other adapters that Colony makes and SNS makes to be able to use with this adjustable push rod tube. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to put our lifter blocks on. And to do that, if you're using the kind like we're using, you're going to have to pull out the little stopper pins here in the corner that kept your stock blocks from rotating. So we pull them out, and then we're going to put our blocks on here. No matter what kind you use, you're going to torque these bolts 15 to 18 foot-pounds, put a touch of blue Loctite on there. So then we're gonna start the process of adjusting our push rods. Couple things. We need to have whatever cylinder you're gonna work with at top dead center. I'm gonna start in this rear one. There's a couple of ways to think about this. You want the cam lobes down. You want it on the base circle of the cam, which means the other cylinder will have both of the lifters moving at the same time. There's a real easy way to do that. I'm going to show you. We're going to take our broken pieces of push rod, we're going to drop them in the holes. When they get to their lowest point here, this thing is going to be on top dead center, and that's where we're going to start our adjustment. Okay, I have this on top dead center with the base circles of my cam up. This can be kind of hard to see, especially, the lifters don't have any pressure on them. So sometimes it actually helps to stick your fingers down in the holes, have somebody turn the wheel, and you can feel them stay down. When they're both down, you're where you need to be. So at this point, we're ready to get our quickie push rods in there and start adjusting. But we have to put together our cover here. And I have one all the way assembled so you can kind of see it. So these are going to collapse like this to give us the room underneath to adjust them. So when you put them together, they go together in a specific order. There's this fat O-ring, and you can see it's a different diameter than the one down here. It's slightly smaller. That goes to the top of the push rod. The bottom of the push rod gets the larger diameter fat O-ring. The small tube is next. Before you do that, you need the thinnest O-ring, the flat washer, and the spring all on before the cup. So you can see how that goes. Once we have those together, we're going to put the push rod in there. The push rod, you need to take all of the adjustment out of it. We're going to thread it way up in there. We took the lock nut, we spun it to the bottom, and then we're going to thread this all the way up in there. When you get it threaded up in there, it's going to collapse, and that's exactly what we want. So once it's collapsed, you can put the push rod in the tube. Now that we have all of this together, we'll put it into the engine. And when we put it up in there, we want to kind of get a positive seat on this, but we're going to check it again later. The other thing is we're going to end up using something, the most common way is a rubber band and a paper clip, to hold this up while we do our adjustment. But we'll get to that in a second. Let's go ahead and put this in here. So I'm going to turn this a few times like that to get that lock nut caught on there. What I'm going to do is take all the lash out, meaning right now this is what's considered lash, the slop up and down in the push rod. We're going to adjust all that out. We're going to spin this bottom part down so there's no more up and down movement in there. Then what we're going to do is we're going to turn this what's called 24 flats. A flat is, the flat part of the nut. We're going to do 24 times, which is 4 turns. What 4 turns does is that presses that push rod down into that lifter roughly 100 thou or so. And that should be right in the middle of that lifter's range of movement there. And we're gonna do that to both of these. Now, check your instructions, find out how far, some of them vary, some are 20, some are 24. I could probably go 20 on these if I wanted to. I'm gonna go 24. After we have that done, I'm gonna tighten these up. You need 2 7/16 wrenches to tighten it. And you can hold the bottom of the push rod here with a 1/4 inch wrench. You have to mark one of your flats so you can keep track of how many times around you turned it. And after I get this one adjusted, I'm gonna go ahead and adjust the one next to it. Before we go any farther, we have to wait until we can take these push rods after they've been adjusted and spin them with our fingers. And what we're doing is we're letting those lifters bleed down. If you don't allow that pressure to come off, if you turn the motor over, you could bend a valve or something. And it could take 15, 20 minutes for these to bleed down. So we want them to bleed down, turn them. Once these are bled down, we'll repeat the same process of the tappet block and the push rod adjustment on this cylinder, meaning I'm going to turn the motor over after I can spin these, have my cams at, so the base circles are up and the piston's at top dead center, and I'll do the adjustment on this cylinder here.
That is 4, aka 24 flats. There. Should be pretty good. That one actually I can see pretty good. And that right there is where we want it. Go up in here, right here. Yep. Four. Sweet. It's hard to spin that way. That's 4. Okay, now we need to finish putting the push rod tubes together, which means we slide the chrome parts of the tubes down, and then we take this little clip with this piece here. We're gonna put the top in, compress the spring on that collar, and then snap this in there, which is a lot easier than what it's actually gonna be for you. You make a fancy tool like this. If you have one of these, it'll be easy. If you don't, got to use the screwdriver. I'm gonna put that up in there. I'm gonna put the screwdriver underneath of it, using it as a ramp, also to push down the spring and try to snap it in there. And it's gonna be a real like positive engagement. You can't really miss if you got it in there or not.
Okay, so we have all of our pushrod tubes assembled, and at this point, your assembly of the rest of your bike is probably gonna be a little bit different than ours because you probably have a modified bike. But as far as the cam install go, you are done. So we're going to put on our sprocket cover, our carburetor, gas tank, so on and so forth. We're gonna wrap this up. Now, jetting, you are gonna have to address jetting, and I can't give you any specifics on that really because everybody's bike's a little bit different pipes, different intakes, things like that. Could be a different carb too. We're using a CV carb on that, on this bike here. So I would tell you, depending on what you're going from, like this was an 883 that we did a 1200 conversion to, so we're actually going from 883 jetting on a 1200 with cams. So we're gonna make quite a big leap. I'm gonna start with about 2 main jet sizes, 2 pilot jet sizes. I'm gonna hopefully lean a little bit to the fat side of things. We're gonna put fresh plugs in it and read our plugs. But as far as the break-in for the motor, if you're just doing cams, you're not gonna have a lot more break-in. There's not, you know, obviously the cams are new in there. So I would do kind of a general break-in like I would with the big bore. I put fresh oil in it, heat cycle it, take the oil out after 2 heat cycles, put new oil in it, and then break it in like you would new engine for 500 miles, and then go rip on it. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop us a comment. Go work on those motorcycles.